Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to K's side event at Asia Clean Energy Forum 2021. I am Mark Tagob. I am the communications manager at ACE Partners, that's Asia Clean Energy Partners. I'm also part of the Case communications support team coordinating Thailand and the Philippines. Thank you for joining us tonight. Our side event, Evidence-Based Communications to Propel the Energy Transition, is the only session at ASEF that highlights the underutilized potential of communications, particularly evidence-based communications to drive the clean energy transition. Please remember that this side event is a discussion and a communication among peers. We would like to hear from you. In fact, using the chat function, feel free to introduce yourselves and where you are from. Please also remember that you can use the chat function to provide insights, feedbacks, questions to our speakers and panelists. To kick off this side event, I'd like to call Fabi Tumiwa for his opening remarks. Fabi is the Executive Director of the Institute of Essential Services Reform. Fabi's areas of expertise includes energy policy and regulation, renewable energy technology and economics, and energy transition policy. He has been carrying out studies and analysis on energy and electricity policies in Indonesia and at the global level. Fabi,
Thank you.
take the floor.
Allow me to share my screen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. CASE, or Clean, Affordable, and Secure Energy for Southeast Asia program is a unique program that comprises of regional implementing partners, which Agora and New Climate Institute from Germany, with the coordinator of GIZ. And this program works with 4 national implementing partners in the region. From Indonesia, Institute for Essential Services Reform, where I belong, and from the Philippine Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. One of Red Constantino is also here. In Thailand, the partner is TDRI, Thailand Development Research Institute, and in Vietnam is the Vietnam Initiative for Energy Transition. The CASE program funded by Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety of the Federal Republic of Germany, or BMU. And also in the implementation of this program, we align with the Energy Transition Partnership, with the initiative of government and philanthropies to also enhance energy transition in this region. Well, CASE objective is to build the narrative of the direction of the energy sector in Southeast Asia and substantially shifted towards evidence-based. This is the key, evidence-based energy transition, and aiming to increase political ambition to comply with Paris Agreement. And in order to meet this objective, we have 5 thematic works. First is research and evidence, where we bring all the evidence base for the energy transition in Southeast Asia. We would like to present that to our policymakers. Transparency and mapping. And this is, I think, very, very important in terms of a dialogue with non-energy stakeholders, because we believe that energy transition is not just this, the decision from the energy sector stakeholders, but also because of the impact and the implications, we have to bring in non-energy stakeholders as well into this dialogue. We also provide technical assistance to increase the capacities of the key energy stakeholders to undertake an energy transition and promoting public discourse of energy transition. And this is the 5 output of CASE program. And one of the our current work is actually related with the research and assessment framework, when we look at in terms of building narrative, we look at what is actually key challenge for energy transition in this region, engage with the key stakeholder, look at their perspective and how to bring them to support the energy transition in all four countries, and look at the policy windows of opportunities where we, through our research and gap identification, and later on we build the strategy strategy in our five outputs. And as the project that or program that about shifting or strengthen the narrative of the energy transition, communication is very important in case. And we believe that communications is a very powerful tool and a driver to support a narrative change on energy transition in the regions towards evidence-based policy choice and strategy. And therefore, CASE also believe that an evidence-based communication approach will ensure the accuracy of shared information and the effectiveness of how it is shared. And in order to do this, and because this is very important, CASE has set up a separate communication support team to support the overall CASE consortium in the area of communication and knowledge management. So communication is a really important part in our work. And in order to have an effective communication, we do communication assessment, which currently we are doing, and it start with develop a communication approach based on the evidence, and we have done communication landscape assessment in 4 CASE countries, in Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. And all of this assessment are done with the partnership of the local expert organization in these 4 countries. And while all of the assessment is done, and we look at the 4 area in terms of communication strategy and formulation of communication objective, the identification of the target audience and the key message and communication channels. So this is part of our, this is all a process of our communication strategy process. One of the particular output of our communication is the establishment of Energy Transition Knowledge Hub. And this kind of the interactive platform in order to create dialogue and coordination in the Southeast Asia power sectors, and to equip policymakers and business with the knowledge and capacity to manage the power sector transition in socially just way. So we are now preparing this knowledge hub, and hopefully we can launch this by the end of 2021. But this also is not just policymaker, but we also are targeting general public and the energy practitioners, yeah, as well as decision makers. So that include different elements in this. So stakeholders activity database, also in interactive research platform, data tracking and visualization of all of this data in the region to measure energy transition progress, and networking. We hopefully also create networking and learning community in this region. CASE is run until the 2024, early 2024, and hopefully we can meet, and I believe that we can meet all of our goals. Well, if you want to know more about CASE, please contact Simon Roland, the program directors based in GIZ, and Sacha, also program coordinator for CASE. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fabi. It looks like we had a bit of problem with the chat function. Let's give it another go. Please let us know your name and where you're from so that we can try the chat function. It looks like the chat function is working well. Remember that you can ask questions via the Q&A. To provide us the context for tonight's event, I'd like to welcome Christiana Rosbach to the virtual platform. Christiana leads Edelman's Indonesia's international public affairs portfolio with a focus on Southeast Asia regional work. Her distinct integrated communication strategies and campaigns have been recognized by the industry through awards, including the Marketing Interactive PR Awards in 2021, Public Affairs Asia 2017's Gold Standard Awards, and PR Week Asia Awards 2015. Christiana is also a panelist. Christiana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Fabi, for the excellent welcome remarks. And of course, a warm welcome to everyone who's joining this panel discussion today. Welcome to the Asia Clean Energy Forum side event on evidence-based communication to propel the energy transition. I acknowledge that the title we chose for this session is quite a mouthful, but hear us out. We chose it on purpose. Before I explain in detail why we opted for this title to set the scene for this event, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Christiana Rosbach, and I'm a co-lead of the Case Communication Support Team that Fabio already mentioned in his welcome remarks. Our communication support team is actually a consortium of Edelman, a global leading communications firm, and ACE Partners, an energy consulting firm. And as already mentioned by Mark, I'm also working for Edelman Indonesia. Over the past 6 months, I've had the opportunity to be part of the CASE project. And I also had the opportunity to start working with experts from the local and international expert organizations that form the CASE team in the 4 countries, so Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. Many of you here today have years and decades of experience in the area of clean, affordable, and secure energy. As I'm not an expert in this field, my remarks will focus on an outside-in perspective from the standpoint of a communications professional. So over the past couple of months, while I started working with the CASE team and on this very fascinating and complex topics, I have thought a lot about some of the following questions. So what is the energy transition and why does it matter? Next slide. Yeah. And why should it matter to those who can help advance it? And what would it take really to make it happen, and to make it happen not sometime in the distant future, but to really make it happen now? These might be very basic questions for the people here in the room, but from a communication perspective, defining what that energy transition means, why it matters, and why it needs to happen now are actually really critical elements that will help us to create the support and the urgency. So making this case for an energy transition is also the mission critical of the CASE project. And there's lots of work going on that I see while I'm working with the team on all fronts to bring together expertise, gather evidence, to demonstrate why the energy transition is not just really a nice to have, but mission critical for the region to leapfrog in the years to come. So with all of this important work underway, not just by CASE, but also by many of you in the region, what role can communication play to make this case for the energy transition and to help propel the energy transition forward? So the most obvious way in which communication can help propel the energy transition is by making key stakeholders realize the opportunity. In particular, decision makers, but not just in the energy field, also from non-energy public sector stakeholders, financial institutions, business communities, as well as influential consumers. And when we're talking about influential consumers, what do we mean? So influential consumers are those who are more engaged with society as a whole and are therefore more engaged with the societal impact of business. And we've been tracing this for a couple of years now with Edelman, and we've seen quite a rise in this area. And these influential consumers are more likely to share their opinions with and to seek influence over others. They consume news just like others, but they also write to editors, they attend public meetings, or they serve in community level committees. And while they are not the decision makers per se, belief-driven buyers are more and more influential in shaping the way business, financing institutions, and to some degree also public sector institutions act. And how can we convince those stakeholders, particularly amid an unprecedented situation of economic distress, amid this global pandemic, to prioritize an energy transition and a green recovery amid many other considerations? Well, part of the answer can be evidence. The right evidence at the right time that aligns with their interest and that aligns with their agenda. And through evidence that is delivered also in the right way, through the right channels, that can reach them with a message that is able to cut through the noise. Well, cutting through the noise, easier said than done nowadays. Today, each of us actually generates more information than ever before. This flood of information in modern times is generated by the media and many other information sources and has led to a daily, let's call it, bombing of the average human brain. The problem is our brains haven't evolved to be able to process it all. And the problem with that, our average attention span, and I'm sure you've all already seen this, has decreased from 12 seconds in 2000 to 8 seconds in 2017. Why is this very alarming? Well, because it is currently less than what is assumed to be the attention span of 9 seconds that a goldfish may have. And while you may be familiar with this statistic, something else that is quite concerning or that we should consider as we're driving communication approaches is that in 2020, amid the pandemic and stay-at-home orders, global online content consumption doubled according to recent surveys. So it's only a lot more than what we've previously assumed. So what can we take from this? More evidence alone may not be the answer. Having more evidence at hand is, of course, critical. So it is important that we gather all of this evidence, that we really drive this evidence more. But it is equally important to decide which evidence, which argument will work best for which audience, and to then select that very carefully. And this is where, beyond the hard facts as well, and the facts and figures, the power of storytelling really comes in. Why storytelling? You may say, okay, we're talking about evidence. Why are we now talking about storytelling? Because storytelling, if done right, is really powerful. Human brains are actually hardwired to process and store information in the form of stories. Since we were kids, we were being told stories and we enjoy them. This is why stories, they really engage us like little elves. They stimulate our senses and they involve us emotionally as well as intellectually. They can put a face on an issue and they can help us connect with it through empathy. This is really important fact, even when we're talking about evidence. And ultimately, stories are really what makes us connect as humans. So from a communication perspective, this is really, really critical. So what can we take from this again? A narrative that is based on emotive storytelling approach really has the potential to raise awareness, drive engagement, and to create these kind of conversations that we're seeking, not just with consumers, but with stakeholders too. They are humans too. But how do we craft the right stories and narratives? And how do we then select also the most powerful pieces of evidence to underline why the energy transition needs to happen and needs to happen now? Well, this is where evidence can come in again, and where we see really a chance in widening the perspective of an evidence-based communication to shift from that pure focus on communicating evidence to an approach that also asks us how we communicate this evidence. This allows us to take a more integrated approach instead of treating communication just as a visibility exercise and as an afterthought. And I am really excited to be part of this case project because I do have the feeling that together with the local expert organizations, that is really what we're doing. So we're currently developing a more insights-driven communications approach. It's sometimes hard, it's not easy. It's an iterative process, but it's well worth it. And together with the local expert organizations, we're at the moment preparing a communications landscape assessment. And I already saw that there were some questions in the chat box around what that communication landscape assessment actually is. So for each of the 4 countries, we're at the moment looking really into the communications environment, into audience insights, and into conversation insights to first understand the world and the environment that we're operating in. And it's really exciting to work together with those with all of these experts on this and to have these very, very interesting and sometimes also challenging conversations on how we can drive this and how we can move this forward. And I'm very much looking forward today to the panel discussion and to the perspectives of our esteemed panelists on a number of different areas. And there are just 2 questions that I would like to throw out. And that would be, on the one hand, what kind of evidence and narratives would really help us to propel the energy transition in the region and globally? And also, what kind of insights-driven, so evidence-based communication approaches can we leverage to really make it happen? And with that, I would like to thank you for providing me with the opportunity to set the scene for the panel discussion. And I would like to hand back to Mark to lead to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christiana. Storytelling, if done right, is powerful. That's very insightful. Linking evidence in storytelling, that's very good, Christiana. Thank you for setting the context of our side event. As mentioned in the beginning, this side event is going to be a discussion and conversation among peers. To moderate our panel discussion, I'd like to call Peter Dupont. Peter Dupont is a managing partner of Asia Clean Energy Partners. He has more than 30 years experience in sustainable energy and climate programs in the US and Asia. He has worked in a variety of roles, consulting and managing for nonprofit and private consultancies and development agencies with a focus on energy efficiency, renewable energy, finance, and market initiatives, and climate change. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. And I'd like to invite the other panelists on, to go into panel view if we can. And I will introduce the panelists. First, Ganda Saputra. Ganda is the Outreach and Engagement Advisor at IESR. He has more than 10 years of professional experience in the field of communications, social media, and community relations. And we're delighted to have you here today. Ganda, how are you?
Very well. Thank you very much, Peter.
Welcome. Awesome. And our next panelist is Red Constantino, who's the Executive Director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities. Red has over 3 decades of experience. I guess that makes him about as old as me. Sorry about that. In international climate, development, and environment campaigning organizations spanning South, Southeast Asia, East and Central Asia. Welcome, Red.
Thank you, Peter.
Great. Now we have, coming from Europe, we have Rana Adib. Rana is the Executive Director of the Renewable Energy Policy Network for the 21st Century, REN 21. She's an industrial engineer and an international program manager, a multi-stakeholder governance expert with more than 20 years of experience. And she launched a very important report last night, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct? Your global status update was launched in Asia?
Yes, in Asia and the day before globally.
Okay, so you're quite busy this week. That's awesome. That's
Yes.
what we love about ASEF, is bringing people together to do business and talk to each other and network. Finally, I'd like to invite Marcus Steigenberger, who's the managing director of Agora Energiewende, a nonpartisan think tank focusing on the transformation of energy systems. Marcus has 20 years of experience in European and international energy and climate policy. Welcome to the panel, Marcus.
Hello, pleasure to be
Great.
here.
So I'm going to build, just reflect briefly on, so what I want to do is spend as much time as we need, maybe 30 minutes going through a couple rounds of questions and then open it up to the floor for another 30 minutes, but we'll see how it goes. Christiana sort of raised a number of important issues. First issue is, what will it take to make the energy transition happen? I think in a lot of the discussions this week, it's just assumed that the examples that you talk about and the initiatives that you describe when you're presenting to an audience will sort of create action and take things further. And ASEF is sort of, it's mostly a group of insiders who are working in clean energy. It's getting a bit broader, and that's good. But this whole idea of, you have evidence, but it's really hard to actually communicate and push those facts out and actually get them to be heard. So, I love the sort of emphasis on the power of storytelling, and the questions that Christiana left us with on, what kind of evidence can we develop? What kind of influence can we bring to the table to make it happen? And I'm going to reiterate something that Mark said in his introductory remarks, that this is the only communications focused session at ASEF. And I think that it's not a good sign. So anyway, let's start some momentum here and have a great discussion. So, a couple things as we go into the discussion. Then I'm going to start with Ganda in just a moment. Okay, first, it's hard to communicate and push facts and have them heard and understood in the way we wish them to be received. That points to the need for effective storytelling, which Christiana highlighted. So what we're going to focus on, we're going to do two rounds. The first question is going to focus a bit more on asking the panelists for their experience, gathering evidence and developing narratives on the energy transition and what their organization's role is in trying to sort of move the needle. So first, Ganda. IESR conducts research and advocacy in the energy sector with a significant focus on what reforms are needed to transition to a low carbon, clean energy future. What are the dominant narratives around the energy sector in Indonesia today? And what are the key types of evidence that you and your colleagues are using to make the case to advance the energy transition in terms of the economic, environmental, and social aspects? And if you could take about 3 minutes with your opening remarks, and that way we can keep things moving and generate questions. Over to you, Ganda.
I think we just lost Ganda.
Ganda has left the building. Okay. Well, with that, Red, we'll jump over to you. Red, you've been active in energy policy research, community organizing, and public advocacy in the Philippines energy sector and regionally for decades, as we heard when I introduced you. So what are the dominant narratives around the energy sector in the Philippines today? And what is your diagnosis of the current situation?
Thank you, Peter. The role that communications plays in the change process across Asia, in particular Southeast Asia, and specifically the energy transition, that role is vital and central to ensuring that change that is underway actually impacts working families the most, especially small and medium enterprises, whether it's in Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, or Indonesia. The most important parts that I think we need to recognize, first of all, is that the energy transition is not something that is people will be waiting for in the future. It is already underway. There's a saying that I think is still very much true and applicable to our current discussion, that change is often something that takes longer than what you expect. But when it is underway, it is often occurring at a pace that's faster than what you had anticipated. Those two dynamics are already in place at the moment. And I think many, or if not all of my colleagues on the panel will agree that we will eventually reach our landing zone where clean energy will be dominant. That is not the question. The question is, how soon can we arrive there? Can we get there sooner? Can we shave off 5 or 7 or 10 years of long, hard campaigns in order to bring the benefit of modern, clean, affordable, and secure energy to the table inside the houses of long-working families? And what does that tell us? The narrative needs to speak to the working families in the region primarily, and that in this process of change, in a transition, we need to make sure that we get as many as we can supporting and benefiting from this transition. We also need to understand that there will be trade-offs. Not everyone will win, and those who will lose are those who choose to remain stuck in what is still remaining to be a dominant discourse that we can do with our status quo, we can do with some, but big changes are not really necessary. That will be a problem for businesses especially, who refuse to see that the transition that we're already in is already underway. For different sectors, in particular for civil society, that narrative also has to be grappled with and debated fiercely. Number one, civil society doesn't have a monopoly of good intentions here. We need to recognize that government also shares the dream of clean energy, not just clean, but affordable and reliable and secure energy, which is their primary objective. The question then is, how can we work together to ensure that this debate goes beyond the energy sector? Because what is wrong here primarily is a narrative that believes that we can fix this problem only by tinkering around with electricity or with members of the power sector, when in fact, this is a space that should be enjoyed by economy-wide participation, by neighborhoods, by cities, by households, not just by big business, but by small and medium enterprises as well. This is about change that can provide modernization to the lives of people, because when you provide reliable, affordable energy, children can learn, children can go to school, health services can be available in a way that can catapult pretty much everything that makes the economy run. In a way, our challenge is how to upgrade everything, and not just through technology. We need to upgrade mindsets that look at energy as something that encompasses more than what you plug into your power sockets or the technologies even of renewable energy. We need to promote systems thinking rather than individual technologies. We need to move away from the fragmentation that we've been so used to, thinking that one technology can be pitted against another, rather than looking at all of them combined and seeing that ultimately, based on the evidence that we're seeing, a mix that is dominated by variable renewable energy and storage, including what we have now, is enough to propel us to a future that really will be dominated, if not framed by, a wholly renewable energy powered society. In a broad way, we are excited at the challenge that we have. We are compelled by the amount of changes we're seeing in families, in neighborhoods, in communities, and certainly by the big decisions that are being taken, even as we speak, from the governments in Philippines or Indonesia and Vietnam. It is underway. We just need to move faster and more decisively.
Thank you. Thanks. That was excellent. And I'm not going to try to summarize everything, but there's some points worth, highlighting. We're in the middle of the energy transition, and what we're trying to figure out is how we get there faster. And the focus on working families, neighborhoods, households, and small businesses, and getting outside of just the energy sector bubble that we're in. Frankly, we're in it at ASEF now. And the need to upgrade mindsets. So that was some very good remarks. Ganda, I thought you were running away from me. I introduced you, and then Ganda had left the building. So welcome back.
Thank you, I hope so.
Picking up on Red's comments, IESR conducts research and advocacy in the energy sector, and you're really focused on reforms. That's the name of your organization, IESR, the Institute for Energy Sector Reforms. What do you see as the dominant narratives in the energy sector in Indonesia, and how are you trying to make what is the evidence to sort of make the case for an accelerated energy transition as Red discussed?
Thank you, Peter. I apologize for the connection problem. Just in time, I got reconnected. On that point, IESR, we're in a think tank organization. Our main focus is on energy and climate. To respond to your question, I guess Pakasticate, particularly in Indonesia, energy transition is not a phenomena that already been well known. In the past decade, the narrative is very much dominated with the narrative of coal industry. As we may know that Indonesia is like heavily on coal production and coal export. So this has become the main, mainly the communication process of the Indonesia. With also the widespread of the country within the archipelago, it's very much also energy sector. It's mainly not dominated as a conversation or as a communications in a way, especially in Java Island when the central the government is actually located and centralized in Java. It could be the case of the energy communication driven. It's mainly in outside Java Island, but this mainly does not being covered really well in a national scale. So yeah, responding to that, ISR, it's really heavily on an evidence base, and we work based on the research and study, which is this is the main the objective. And our specialties is actually working on a communication with the higher officials and the government of Indonesia. From there, we would love to bring this discussion towards the public engagement and public advocacy that would be done for the past 5 to 10 years in a way. So to respond to that case, that would be also it's very interesting point raised by Ren before in a way that energy transition is actually happening in the global. But I would say that unfortunately, this is probably not the main understanding or the case in Indonesia in terms of communication or in terms of discussion and public discourse. We are very in a tip of the toe in terms of energy transition and the political discussion and political will. Yet, it's very challenging as well to bring this kind of discussion within the public sphere. Just to understand what is the energy transition itself and why does it matter, while it doesn't really speak to their in a daily activity on a daily basis as long as they have access to the energy. So this is could be the main challenge for us in a communication practitioner in a way how to bring up evidence that as the name of essential reform, we work based on the important and the needs of the public. We are do not represent any kind of industry or business. We work based on the essential needs of the public. So we believe that this has become the very basic needs and necessity to publicly outspoken back again that this is important matters, that this is actually happening, and the fact that this has actually become a global trend in worldwide, and why does that is actually matter for Indonesia. This discussion needs to be taking over as well.
Thank you. And my producer corrected me. I'm sorry, I butchered the name of IESR. Sorry about that. It's the Institute for Essential Services Reform. You do energy sector reform, but apologies on that. Yeah, so, interesting question about, pivoting a bit from influencing government, the Bappenas, the PLN, the MEMR, to influencing the public. And there's a great question, which I won't ask now, but from Knud Vecking, who says, a convinced general public isn't enough, but essential for pressure. Our experience at Urgewald is that we need to influence the financial public and sector, the public and private sector. I won't go into that question, but that's sort of a point along those lines. Thanks. I'm going to move over to Marcus. And Marcus, good. Let's see, where are you? It is afternoon for you. It's evening for me. Marcus, your organization, Agora Energy Venda, describes itself as an independent, vision-driven think tank that develops evidence-based and politically viable solutions for a climate-neutral global economy. How would you describe your approach to communication and what lies at its core?
Yes, thanks a lot, Peter. Let me start with the dilemma that political or vision-driven think tanks, as but also others, are facing, and that is the dilemma between a very dynamic political world and a rather slow scientific world where you just need time to produce the evidence. And the problem that many of us have already been facing many times is that once you are ready with your research and you can go out, that the political agenda has already moved ahead, and you're simply too late, and whatever you have to tell is interesting for the expert community, but it's not really relevant from the political point of view anymore. So that led us to basically spend a lot of time thinking about the question of how do we develop and communicate evidence? How do we do it in order to be politically relevant and helpful? And let me maybe shed a bit light on two aspects, two methods that we are conducting a lot here. And the first one is which we call a bit pathetically strategic anticipation, which means that we are really seeing the need to look ahead as far as possible. So at least 1 or 2 years ahead, to really think about, so what's going to be on the political agenda in 2 years from now? What is it that we need to have ready in terms of research, in terms of evidence in 2 years? What is it that we need to start now in order to be relevant? In other words, we already start thinking about communication before we actually start the actual research. And it does not always work, but ideally we have the answers ready before the questions have been asked by the decision makers. And if it works, it can actually be quite powerful. Second aspect that we found very helpful is this joint fact-finding methodology. That's something that many organizations use today, which basically means to be really integrating and inclusive, to invite stakeholders and multipliers very early on in our research. So what we do usually is we really have all relevant stakeholders sitting at the table. We share and make transparent all the data, all the assumptions. We invite them to share their views, to give their opinions, etc. And that is helpful in the sense that you're creating a sense of ownership. People really start to get into this, to develop this ownership, and they take the content and the messages home to their organizations, and they discuss further in their organizations. And so through this, you actually already communicate without communicating. I mean, without really going public and without even having done the research. But this is a very powerful method in our view, because it really helps to spread and to manifest a certain idea, a certain research and messages in a relevant community. So there's more you could talk about, but this thinking about how do you do it to overcome this dilemma between fast and dynamic politics and slow and sound research is for us, I think, what we would call the core of our communication work. Thanks. Back to you, Peter.
Yeah, there's also the fact that our brains are slow. We're not sort of wired to deal with, I think Red mentioned this, the fast change, the world is changing so fast, it's a little bit hard for people to process. Excellent points. Even though you poo-pooed the name strategic anticipation, it's a pretty interesting approach. The sort of starting now to think about the research questions that policymakers will need in the future. And then also this idea of the Zen of communicating without communicating by the process you have for inclusive research. So thanks for sharing that. I'd like to move over to Rana Adib. Rana, REN 21 was created in 2004 as an outcome of the Bonn 2004 International Conference on Renewable Energy. Seems like it was just yesterday, doesn't it? This coalition of the willing, it was called, came together with one objective in mind: to support and accelerate the development of renewable energy. What were the narratives around clean energy back then? How have they changed, and where are things stuck?
Thank you very much, Peter, and thanks to all for these insights. And you mentioned that it's the only event on communication at ACEF, but I think it's really great, and I would like to congratulate to have this event here, because from REN 21 side, we clearly feel that there is a need to strengthen renewable energy leadership, and this goes much beyond technical expertise or political energy expertise. So very supportive of this. So when REN 21 was created, I think for the ones who, so I'm going to mention it because I think it's building on what Marcus said. REN 21 is really a community of players from science academia, NGOs, industry, and governments. And this sounds a bit messy, but can be extremely powerful when it is about advancing alliances, advancing topics, and systems approach. And building on this spirit, the starting point for REN 21 was very clearly to create crowdsourced information with, in 2005, the first objective to make renewable energy visible. The reality in 2005 was that official energy statistics did not show that renewable energy was existing. We had, however, as network feedback from project developers, industry, finance world, that projects were there. And since renewable energy had the advantage, but also disadvantage, I guess, of being decentralized, there is fragmented markets. The approach was really to tap into this community of players of REN 21, consolidate information, and show that renewable energy existed, and that it was US dollar invested, installed capacities, and energy services provided. Linked to, again, economic opportunities for markets, services provided. So there is a dedicated chapter, for instance, in the Renewables Global Status Report, which we are producing since 2005 annually. And so in the energy access part, also showing the off-grid advantages, and that renewable energy is much more than energy. It is really about societal and economic benefits, societal, environmental, economic benefits. So I think when I'm looking, I'm looking, basically, we just launched, as Peter mentioned, on Tuesday, the 16th edition of the Renewables Global Status Report, which is building on this community of change makers, I guess like 200 to 300 people contributing to this. And we had a very interesting experience this year. The discourse has changed a lot, I think. In the beginning, it was about making renewable energy visible and relevant. Today, we clearly see that as renewable energy players, we cannot afford anymore to only look at what is happening on the renewable energy side. The reality is, when we are looking at the last 10 years, renewable energy share in total final energy consumption, and this is now a bit technical, but has grown from approximately 9% to 11%. So when you look at this, you think like, great, growth rate, things are advancing, investments are going up, capacity, costs are going down, there is a major opportunity. And the opportunity is real. And I think this is something which is important. we need to speak about the opportunities. And I think, Christiana, you had mentioned it, the dream part. And that's something which is still part of it. The reality, however, and I think that's something which was also underlined before, when we are speaking about the change towards an efficient renewable-based energy system, but also economy, it's not a change which only requires the energy supply side to change. Everybody is consuming energy, and this means that everybody is an actor of this change, in particular on the energy demand side too. And it's not only national governments, it's also cities. It's the finance sectors. And building on this, actually, it also means that we need to look at what is happening in the overall energy system. And we cannot only look at what's happening on renewables, but we need to look what's happening on the fossil fuel side. And the reality here is actually mind-blowing. And that's basically one of the data which is picked up the most from press, for instance, this year. The share of fossil fuel in our total final energy consumption globally has moved from 80.3% to 80.2%. So it is stagnating. Even though basically when we're looking at what's happening on the renewable side, things are happening globally in the overall energy system, we are very far of being on track. And I think this is basically the part where we recognize as REN21 and as a renewable energy player today that it's not enough anymore. And the stakes is not about making renewables mainstreamable and a technical solution, etc. Renewables have shown, especially in the power sector, that they are possible, that they're able to deliver. It's a technology which is mature. It is very often the least cost option. There is co-benefits or benefits for players engaging here. And we also see that, for instance, corporations clearly follow this. But the reality is, however, that today it's not enough actually to say that let's support renewables. We need to clearly have a message on banning fossil fuel. And for REN21, this means, for instance, that we had to start building up other types of evidence too, and creating other connections. So for instance, including in our renewable status report, so to say, information about fossil fuel subsidies. 115 countries are still subsidizing fossil fuel, $550 billion per year. The investment in renewable energy is $303 billion. So you clearly see the it means that we are not only looking at the status, but we need to put the status in comparison to the vision and the dream. So the reality is, yes, we're all working towards 1.5 degrees. We're supportive of the SDG scenarios. We also see that more conservative forces are supporting this. The reality is, IEA and IRENA really show that the investment here that are needed need to triple on average per year. And the growth rate in 2020 over 2019 was of 2%. So tripling means 2% compared to 200%. And I think this is basically the part where we see that it's about building other evidence, but also framing it in a way that it also becomes relevant to players who need to be held accountable for, and giving the arguments to also enter a dialogue with those players here. And I'll just end on the dialogue part, because I think that from K-side, for instance, this dialogue on the non-energy players, we clearly feel that this is something which is extremely important. Over 80% of the energy being consumed is consumed for heating, cooling, and transport. The share of renewable energy in heating and cooling is of 10%, in transport of 3.4%. We always speak about power, where we have a share of 27%, and it's rising. It's the least cost option. It makes not only environmental but economic benefits. Now, when we're looking at these sectors, we realize that the decision makers are sitting on the energy demand side much more. It's the building sector, it's the industry, it is cities, it is fleet operators, and they are very often not being part of the discussion when we speak about the energy supply. And interestingly, we see that often energy is actually not the main driver. Their concerns is about providing good transport, public transport services on the city level, healthy environment for citizens, and air quality. And this is probably the other element where we feel that we need to learn and be more humble as energy player energy is central, and I think we on the energy side have this shared understanding, but it is not the priority for everybody. So on the health side, it will be health services, and our role as energy players is to maybe step back on our energy topic and rather have a discourse how energy can serve another political agenda. And so just on when listening to Marcus part on the strategic anticipation, I would complement this by not only strategic anticipation, but also thinking outside the box and just broadening our angle basically, and reducing the blind spots and linking this to political processes outside of energy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rana. There's so much there. I thought going from 80.3% to 80.2% is pretty good, you know? It's like, that's shocking. That's really shocking. And the fossil fuel subsidies are shocking. There's so many good points there. I think I'll just highlight the fact that you echoed much of, a key point that Red made about who are we talking to and the other stakeholders. And you framed it slightly differently, but it's the same concept. The dialogue that we're not having the dialogue on heating, cooling, and transport. I mean, some people are, but not, most of us at ASEF, many of us are focusing on the power sector because it's easier to see how you can make some headway there first. What I want to do is go to Christiana, and then we have a lot of good questions, and I'll direct the questions to different panelists and see if others want to add on. But first of all, to you, Christiana, thank you again for the really text poor, visually appealing scene setter presentation. Edelman is one of the world's largest PR firms. What are your reflections on what you've heard so far from these energy experts? What are the benefits of having a more evidence-based approach? And if you were going to pursue that, for those of us who've been focused for a long time, like Rana, Red, Fabi, myself, for those of us who've been really focusing for a long time on influencing energy policy and pushing for larger amounts of clean energy, what are some of the blind spots? What should we be thinking and doing differently? Now, some suggestions have already been made in the panel, but what's your take on this, Christiana?
Thank you so much, Peter. And really, really interesting thoughts and really interesting conversation. So thoughts around communicating and communicating more with evidence and with an evidence-based approach. I think some parts that Red in particular mentioned would be something that we should consider more. And that's really those areas that people care about. And when we're communicating, then choosing that kind of evidence that resonates with the areas that people care about. We just last week launched a report for APEC, for the APEC Secretariat, that focused on the role of multilateralism. And one of the interesting areas was like really focusing on what are the areas of concern that are coming up most. And it is social inclusion, inequality, but really followed by climate change, public education, public health. And if we want to be relevant and if we want to reach out beyond, let's say, those energy stakeholders that are already in the room, that are already talking, that do already understand what energy transition we're talking about and where we want to head. So if we want to broaden this so that we can speed up that acceleration, then we really need to look into maybe picking out a few of those evidence points that are most relating to them and making clear what it really means to them. And that's in a way where I find that this narrative and storytelling approach will be playing a really important role, because ultimately it's about making it relevant to them, and making it relevant for their future, for the future of their kids' lives as well. So it's really about also then understanding who we're talking to and how much we want to focus on the different audiences, because we do not have forever to make this energy transition happen. So we could say we want to reach out to the general public, but that would not necessarily help us to have a very targeted approach. So it's really, even when we're doing public approaches, to understand who would be the most influential voices, who do we want to reach first, Where do they stand at the moment? Are they already aware? Are they unaware? What level of awareness do they need to have? Maybe they don't need to know all the details of the energy transition, but what do they really need to know to become supportive? With that,
That's
back to
great.
you.
Are you done?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Christiana. I want to respect the audience. We now have half an hour, and I want to try to get some pretty concise answers to as many questions as possible. Let's see, the first one, I think I'm going to, so this, I'll kick this over to you, Red. Here's a question from a person named Anonymous. Last name is Attendee. I agree about the power of storytelling, but most of the time I think good storytelling needs to touch personal experience. Meanwhile, in CASE, one of the outputs is research. How do you think that CASE can tell a story from its research products? In a sense, how do you make the research products more interesting to non-technical people? And this anonymous attendee was very polite and said thank you in advance.
I return the favor and I say thank you, because these are questions that we have to keep asking again and again and again, not just in ASEF. Years from now, that question has to be asked constantly. Because if we talk about storytelling and we talk about evidence and we try to combine them, the first bigger question that we need to ask is, okay, evidence and storytelling, for who? Evidence for who? And based on what? Because if you don't tackle those questions early, you're going to be flailing, and flailing is not going to be enough. We need to look at things from a more detailed point of view, but also need to take a step back to see it in a broader picture. Details matter. For instance, when we talk about changes, the work of people, of groups like REN21 existed for so long, tireless, ESR in Indonesia, Agora, the patience to actually try to see the little details that will add up and eventually bring things to where they are right now. I don't think 10 years ago I would have ever expected that the Philippine government would declare a moratorium on greenfield coal in October last year. I certainly don't think that I would have expected Vietnam to have such a huge surge in renewable energy and solar that, in a short, mind-bogglingly short time, they're now the leader in terms of installations of solar in the entirety of Southeast Asia. I would not have thought, if Fabi was not a friend of mine who I could ask periodically, that PLN, the Ministry of Energy, and the President of Indonesia would declare a moratorium as well and would say that we will aspire for carbon neutrality. We still don't know how exactly, what the details are, but we will try to get there because things all add up and everything matters. Now, in terms of details, for instance, many people assume that the question of energy, especially the advocates, is all about the environment. Yes, it is, but that's a small subset. When the moratorium on greenfield coal was declared last year, it wasn't because of clean or climate considerations. It was because of evidence that the government had generated, that civil society and think tanks had shared, that showed that there was excess coal capacity that was destabilizing the grid. And to an extent, the recent brownouts in the Philippines is merely a reflection of the same problem, because it's not enough to say that there are outages because there's a supply problem. Many people assume that if it's a supply problem, then add more. But if you add more inflexible, rigid generation, especially baseload coal or baseload gas, which is the fashion trend now, it's not going to cut it. We are going to destabilize things further. And what we need to ask is, what is it that supply really needs to provide? And that is flexible generation that is able to match what people need when they need it. And when it's no longer that demand, then it can ramp down again. In other words, you can spell that as a modern power sector. And a modern power sector is what government wants. It's what the public is trying to chase because they know they will benefit from this. Except that our job is to show that A modern power sector that is run on flexible generation is going to have to be anchored on variable renewable energy, including storage. Are we going to get there soon? Not yet. Not yet, because storage is also not as competitive in terms of its applications today. So what do we need to do? It's not about shutting off coal plants. It's not about replacing them with solar or wind. We're not talking about apples and oranges. We're talking about the things that we need to put together that will create affordable, secure, reliable energy. One fact that is based on evidence. When we talk about coal, we think of the complete opposite. The reality that we need to communicate better is that coal is actually intermittent, is one of the most unreliable, most expensive, and insecure fuels that we can actually bring into any country today. And that is something that we need to share more. Philippines is a good example. We've had brownouts recently. And before the brownouts came, we've recorded thousands of unplanned forced outages. Most of them are from coal. And so the thinking that renewable energy is intermittent is wrong. It's variable. You can predict when it is going to be around. And when you need it, especially in outages of the nature that we experience, is particularly from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m., that is when solar provides baseload power. A lot of things need to change, especially mindsets, including not only in the energy sector, but especially banks. Banks that in the Philippines still behave as if they were pawn shops. They need to change their risk appetites to see that by financing short and shorter term contracts that rely on competition and the market, they'll be able to earn more, but also support a transition that will only speed up and will create further problems for them if they remain stuck on what is going out of fashion, what is obsolete, and what is likely going to be more and more stranded assets in the fossil sector. It's a big challenge, but I think we're all up to it.
Thanks, and I hope and pray that we are. A really good point about the, we don't know what will happen in the future, and the, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Philippines examples you mentioned are a bit mind-blowing because no one would have, very few people would have predicted them, and even yourself, the coal moratorium in the Philippines is. So we don't know what will happen, but we can just do our best to influence it. I want to go to a question. I guess I'm gonna put this to you, Mark. It's a question from Knud Vecking. Target audiences are very important. A convinced general public isn't enough, but is essential for pressure. This came up earlier, and I referenced this point. Our experience at Urgewald, which is a German NGO, is that we need to influence the financial sector, public and private. How do you see solid, evidence provided in the global coal exit list, coalexit.org, and the upcoming global oil and gas exit list, COGEL? Do you intend to use these kind of databases in your work? And that could be either for Agora Energiewende in your work in Europe or the work that you're doing supporting the CASE team in Southeast Asia. Marcus.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, on the general assumption, I fully agree. I mean, it's about looking at the specific target groups, and the financial sector is, I mean, needless to say, not only powerful, but especially in the sense of the transition, it might be actually the key sector. So, yeah, and asking ourselves how to target this sector and the financial institutions is key. Red just referred to the situation in Southeast Asia, but I think it is not very different in other parts of the world. On the specific research, Knut, you're mentioning here, yeah, I mean, in the end, I think there's no general answer to this. Whatever helps, if it's scientifically sound, and I think it's important to underline this, that we should be picky to a certain stage on what kind of research and data we use. But if it's sound and if it's helpful, then be my guest. And of course, we will use it both in the European and in the Southeast Asian sector. But it depends on what do we want to achieve and when to communicate what. I mean, that's something where we have to look into the details. And in the end, it's a case-by-case decision on what we build our arguments, on what evidence we build our arguments best.
Thank you. I just want to share that Natasha Vizcara asked a question of Marcus, and I'll summarize the question and the answer for the benefit of the participants. Question was, does Agora Energy Venda also invite stakeholders who have a contrary view of an issue to their joint fact-finding sessions? Answer is yes, absolutely, but it only works if you seriously engage in open scientific dialogue. Anyway, so I just wanted to share that. Thank you for answering that question in a written manner. And then what I want to do is pivot a little bit, building on Red's answer and discussion about stakeholders. I want to bring in Rana and just ask her a little bit about her work in stakeholder mapping and how that can be used to sort of have an influential communication strategy that results in impact. So REN 21 is doing a lot of work to understand the role of different groups and networks across the clean energy space. Rana, can you describe your innovative approach to mapping networks and influence and understanding who are the influencers, and how does this inform your communication and outreach approach, and how could this be used by those of us here on this panel and those of us who are participating and in the audience today?
Thank you very much, Peter. Yes, basically listening to Red, I thought that this tool is really very interesting, because I would agree. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, nobody would have thought that some countries were moving in that direction. The reality is, however, that since we don't have lots of time to move, we also need to become more strategic, I think, and thinking about where we need to target and what target audiences. And I think we, by default and habit, we probably tend to target the same decision makers, but it can actually be really influential to think a bit outside the box. So this where we kicked this off, basically a process last year when we realized during COVID time that much of the energy discourse was very much, and even discussions about sustainable energy were very much handled and occupied, I guess, like in the global debate, by rather conservative energy players. And that the renewable energy players and efficiency players were more dispersed. And it's also logical, because they are working on energy access, they work at the city level, they work on a certain technology, etc. So this really brought us to this analysis, okay, what do we need to do to become more influential as a renewable energy community? And building on this idea, how can we do some stakeholder mapping to also identify new strategic alliances? We kicked off a communication session basically at the REN 21 Academy, which is for our community, this get together. And it was really interesting because we had somebody from a mining company who was participating. So we brought oil and gas and mining voices to the renewable energy community. And basically this mining company, I'm sorry, I forgot the name, had decided to stop coal mining. And actually, while listening to this and listening that they were focusing on Southeast Asian countries, etc., I thought we should have you with us at the table when we are speaking to those governments, because you're much more influential and you're speaking the same language. So from all those parts, and he clearly said, yes, and we're also happy to do this. So there was this question about, okay, not only the evidence and the message, but also what messengers and what strategic allies. And so the idea here was that we really needed to look into not only the driving forces, but also the rather dragging forces and dragging sectors and new types of stakeholders, because they are today interested in being part of the discussion. They have clearly motivations, whether it is for economic reasons, resilience reasons, climate reasons, ESG, whatsoever. I think there are plenty reasons. But entering a dialogue, into a dialogue with them, but also identifying how we can build on each other would really help to probably become more audible as a renewable community. And so as a result, we have the first attempt or thought was okay, let's reach out to our community and do a stakeholder mapping. But then we thought as a fossil fuel player, this is not what we would be doing. and we would think differently. So we developed an AI-based stakeholder mapping tool, or it's not only a stakeholder mapping tool, it's an influence mapping tool. And so this is still in a pilot phase, and we're discussing with Case how we can work together, and with different players how to work together and make it useful for the renewable community. But I think what we are touching upon is really that identifying other players, identifying the conversations ongoing can help us to also position the energy discussion in a different way, but also bring in messengers to the discussions, into political processes, etc., we would never think about, because actually we are operating in completely distinct ecosystems, and often we're even kind of critical that we would ever be able to have a discussion together. So not every climate person is ready to sit at the table with a Shell CEO, and not every Shell person is going to be ready to enter into Rent-to-Own Academy, where there is 90% of clearly oil and gas non-supportive players. And I think this is exactly the power of such a tool. It's about creating the dialogues. It's about understanding what information, what dialogues we need to influence, but also really understanding with whom we can create alliances to influence then more conservative decision makers, because they might listen to some fossil fuel or mining players much more than when we are coming as a renewable energy community, for instance.
Thank you. There's so many questions. I'll try to touch on a few of them, but also follow the threads. Let's see. There was in the exchange earlier with Marcus, there was a person who was talking about we cannot have different. Well, the fact is we live in a post-truth era, and there are different ideologies to truth itself. And this whole idea of, is there a common set of facts separate from whether, you are talking to the right people and able to influence them? So I'm going to pivot a little bit to a question that Pia Gerdlap asked. He used to be involved in ASEF, and he just finished his PhD in Singapore on industrial, sort of circular economy, industrial engineering. Pia's question is, and I'll throw this to anybody, it's an interesting question. In the context of banning fossil fuels, could we pull from the example of plastic bans? In 2017, the video of a turtle with a straw pulled out of its nose and other ocean plastics pictures sparked outrage, where consumers and government officials were taking action. Plastic waste, export bans, reducing single-use plastics. Could there be some sort of similar breakthrough moment in the clean energy transition, or how can we think about really capturing the attention of a broad swath of the public? And I'll just throw that to anyone.
Peter, let me take a stab at that.
Okay.
I'd give 2 quick points. The first one is that, the example that was given is an indication of how deeply sunk the roots of the fossil fuel industry is around the world. We are still running a fossil economy, and fossil capital is actually real because of the way that the entire world is structured based on what is going to harm us, what is killing us, and what is going to shorten the ability of the world to actually live sustainably with prosperity without the harm that is now besetting us, whether that's in the form of climate impacts, extreme weather, or fossil-based conflicts. To wean ourselves away from that kind of embeddedness, the root, the sunk roots, is not going to be easy. When I say that that an energy transition is already underway, and that we will eventually reach our landing zone, I say that on the predicate that we will struggle and have to fight really, really hard, but that the directions are already evident. It doesn't mean that we will coast and we will reach that place on our own. And that's why communications will be really, really important. I mean, you go to Germany, you look behind you, if you're ironically in the climate negotiations, and in Bonn, you look behind you, you see on the Rhine, massive barges of coal. And that's just taking place up to now. If an industrial power, the largest economy in Europe, with a head of state that has science as their background, cannot just turn the switch on and just move towards clean energy right away, it means the challenges that developing country governments are facing is just as real, if not more difficult. And that's why we need to work together to show, offer, or criticize based on evidence the things that are going wrong and the things that are going well. The other side is, I'd like to use another example. If it's turtles and plastics, I would use two wheels. In the Philippines, thankfully, despite the massive suffering brought about by the pandemic, the same condition has empowered, enabled, and pushed so many thousands to just go ahead and be rebels and cycle their way from home to work, cycling, commuting. 88% of households in the greater Metro Manila area do not own their own cars. And that means that in the last 3 decades, everyone has been trying to build infrastructure for the tiny minority. And so if you talk about energy, you need to think bigger, not just the electricity sector. You need to talk about transport and mobility. You need to see that those who are actually proposing things that will make transport easier and that will promote active mobility is intrinsically linked to our ability to decentralize power in a question of democracy where different local governments, provinces actually consume the power that they also produce, rather than rely on the obsolete thinking of building massive, wasteful, intermittent, unreliable coal plants in order to bring it to someplace else. That world is not only environmentally harmful, it is economically dangerous and will create strains that will empty our coffers that should be going to social services rather than propping up things that are really have no place in our society. Ideology, ideological approaches are not going to take us very far. We need to see what is already on the ground and keep building on it, but also provide avenues and spaces for others to actually take things up. Because renewable energy is not the domain of big business, certainly not of men or of educated people alone. Because right now, solar scholars, for instance, are building community systems made by women, poor women, who may have finished only high school, but who are able to wield the power of sustainable energy because it makes sense for them in their household and in their community. It has to speak to all strata.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Red. We've got about 5 minutes. I'm going to kick a question over to you, Ganda, and then others might want to weigh in. And then I'll ask Christiana to sort of put a wrapper on this and talk a little bit about sort of going forward, what CASE will be doing and reflecting on what she has heard as the co-leader of the CASE communication support team. Question for you, Ganda, is what have been the blind spots specifically? This is from the same person, anonymous, family name attendee. What have been the blind spots specifically in communicating the evidence to influence the financial sector better? Is the evidence not robust enough to convince the financial sector, or is it more of a messaging problem? And what are some concrete examples of successes and lessons learned in Indonesia on influencing the financial sector? And others can weigh in as well. Ganda.
Wow, this is a difficult question to answer, I guess. For the Indonesian context, I think discussing about financial sector is like still one of the most important and major stakeholder that we need to be approached. But it's a very complex matters in a way because lots of the banking or financial sector are also still predominantly also funding the coal and fuel-based power plant in Indonesia. we've been, as the Institute for Essential Services Forum, for the past 2-3 years, I guess, we've been doing this as one of our approach to also participate and join them in terms of this discussion. There has been a lot of discussion and an interest coming from the institutional base, but the decision-making process is, I think, it's the ultimate, the ultimate problem in a financial sector itself. I think most of the financial sector in Indonesia is also mostly a very much profit-driven orientation. It's a very but also given that the fact that there is a lot of rising in terms of RE100 corporation here in Indonesia, there's also bring a very positive gesture and nuance in terms of this electricity demand coming from the RE100 top base in Indonesia, and then also this would be also supporting on the decision making. So to answer the question, what are the blind spot in terms of that? It's a very much very. I hope that the maybe Christiana could be also supporting in that matter. It's very much more political decision making process, as we are again we are still heavily financed coal. Lots of even the top rich community coming from based in Indonesia, they probably own the coal industries or dominating the coal industry, and like taking care of walking through with them, it's very much more complex into the decision to speak on the discussion. But I think there is a great opportunities also to discuss about financial sector in funding. There is also a discussion in terms of investment coming through, or whether or not this is a viable options, and they were looking into it and they're curious. I think the important thing is actually in terms of awareness, and we've as the institute, as the think tank energy here in Indonesia, we've been approaching those kind of communication approach with the finance sector. At least like we also have a local champion coming from the regional level, for example, what we call it the small enterprise business, by providing the installment process for solar panel for solar rooftop panel in their houses, by providing this kind of options. We've just recently also by the end of this year launching our own solar hub platform, which is its try to make closer about the option of democratization of the energy option, that there is an option for you if the policy it's not in a greater, more universal in the country level, but we as a consumer have an option to also install our own solar rooftop in our houses and residentials. And there's a lot of providers and agencies that are providing this kind of financial aids or like financial theme, that this is generating interest towards the society. And ISL also releases some of the market surveys that providing the information and providing the fact that there is a demand and there is a public interest in terms of installing their own solar panel rooftop in their own houses. And this hopefully could trigger the financial sector also to give options energy access to their own with their own decision, while this is also could mobilize the society spoken in discussion to demand a more integrated and more fast and comprehensive policy for the energy system in Indonesia. I think that's my takeaway in terms of the questions.
Thanks. And that's very interesting. Just a housekeeping note. We'll go about 10 minutes over if that's okay. I want to kick this to Red for comment on the Philippines, and then Christiana will wrap up. But I did want to say a couple of things. I remember talking to a German politician a few years ago who said when Germany rolled out this high fit and was doing the big solar rooftop program that, every household was another 2 or 3 voters, right? So it relates to what you were saying about solar rooftop. I thought that was very interesting. What you're saying about RE100, harkens back to Rana's point about getting the right messenger and getting like the positive business side. So, think about RE100, also the whole divestment movement. Interestingly, I heard on a panel earlier today that the UK government is going to require half of companies in the UK to report according to the TFCD, the Task Force on Climate Disclosure, by 2023 and 100% by 2030. So that's a big deal, requiring companies to report their climate data and their climate risks. So some interesting thoughts there. Red, what are your sort of thoughts on this question of sort of the financial sector from the perspective of the Philippines and your experience?
See, Peter, there's a lot of great stuff happening, but there's also a lot of things that remain stuck. The central bank in the Philippines has issued a sustainable finance framework that guides the banking sector as to where they need to go, because they are warning them of the advent of the onset of an era of stranding assets if they don't start to disclose the amount of exposure that they have in terms of the projects that they finance, in particular in the energy sector, in particular in integrating climate risks into their entire portfolio. And that is great, especially because under the central bank leadership now, they're actually saying our finance framework is actually not fast enough, and they're now considering to speed up that process because they see not just the dangers, but the opportunities that they may forgo if they take too long and investment goes somewhere else. Ultimately, the question of energy is all about investments, and it is not renewable energy that is now the alternative. It is fossil fuels that are the alternative. Increasingly, the mainstream option is renewable energy. And that's something that wiser people and also people who need to understand better in the banking sector, the underwriters, the vice presidents that are looking at their own portfolios, that's what they need to understand. The writing is not just on the wall. It's already powering a lot of things, and it will only pick up. And what decisions they make will actually matter for their shareholders in the long run. If they make the wrong decisions now and stick to what they're trying to do, which is, guided by a risk appetite that is just almost like pawn shops, without trusting the power of this market to actually change things in an accelerated way, they will lose, even as others are already gaining right now. Some of the companies in the Philippines are actually investing more heavily in Vietnam because I think they cannot reproduce their capital here as quickly and as massively as they can. And in another country in our neighbor, they can. And so what we need now is not necessarily to ban this or to ban that, but to crowd in the money, the liquidity that's around the region through signals that we provide in policies that actually encourage the transition to move really, really far faster. Another point that I think need to stress is when we talk about avoiding ideological approaches in energy, that's even more critical. I think everyone on this panel and probably most of those who are listening agree that fossil fuels represent a harm to the future of everyone and the entire planet. However, if you were a government official, that's not going to be your metric. Moral arguments are important for the individual to make their decisions, but that is insufficient for businesses and governments as a tool. We need to see what they're facing as well. And if you're in the Philippines, you also know that in the next 5 to 7 years, you may just need everything that you need right now in order for you to be able to phase out the obsolete steadily, manage decline, and manage rise of what is good. That means, for example, to be specific, tackling frontally the question of gas, because gas might be needed in the near future. But if everyone who talks about gas as a bridge fuel starts to describe it as an actual bridge, which means there is no bridge in the world that doesn't have an ending, and you prescribe up to when, then we'll have a more rational discussion. In the Philippines, this is very specific. The more that companies and government officials propose and push for combined cycle gas turbines, they're merely replacing coal as baseload, which means you're just compounding the problem, you're just repeating it. Maybe if you need gas, then it's single cycles, because the bridge that you construct, you can also easily dismantle. Otherwise, you'll be stuck with 25-year contracts where the public will pay, and that doesn't really make sense because you have the decisions you can make today. Renewable energy is not the future. It's already in the present, and we need to make it, establish it as quickly and as widely as we can across the entire Southeast Asian region.
So avoiding, if I can summarize, avoiding bridge to nowhere. Rana has a couple of insights on influencing the financial sector, and then after that, we'll go to Christiana. Rana?
Oh, that's okay. I put them in the I put them into the chat just for time reasons. So
no, please,
maybe
please share them. We can go an extra 3 or 4 minutes. So please go ahead.
Okay, good. So I think one is clearly, and so I'm an industrial engineer. I learned a bit about finance. Every time I'm listening to finance experts, I think they deliberately choose to speak in Latin so that there is no transparency and I can understand what they say. And I experience as an engineer the same when I'm talking to TSOs on grid management, etc. And I think this is for me one of the big blind spots. As a result, when you find yourself in a very expert community, and to some extent we're doing the same, it is extremely difficult for non-experts to be part of it and influence this. So I think for me, there is really one big blind spot is there are ecosystems that work in parallel, but there are also ecosystems that protect themselves by speaking Latin. So I think we really need capacity building and translators here, and I'll take the bridging part. Here we need bridge with 2 endings, which are well anchored in the community that need to be part of the decisions. The other part, and I think this is the finance sector is very clearly going to look into the business cases of their investment, full stop. So the reality is in those metrics and in this thinking, it means that fossil fuel needs to be priced and the pollution linked to fossil fuel needs to be priced. It means that models which are still being used, and I think this is something which still occurs, need to reflect the real cost of renewable energy. And considering the cost reduction that have been enormous during the last couple of years, when you have a model which is looking at costs of 5 years ago, obviously your investment decision will be quite a different one. But the other part is also, and I think there is clearly a growing understanding, and this is for me a major opportunity, that finance or investment in fossil fuel, even though some governments, for, let's be honest, not always financial reasons, but rather political or power dynamics reasons, decide to still go with this. And this is maybe the elephant in the room, which is always difficult to bring to the table, but is just the reality we are facing. But there is an increasing understanding on the finance world that investment in fossil fuel are risky investment. And this is why we see the development of divestment movements. This is why we see that shareholders of oil and gas companies are clearly asking for being more ambitious. And it's also one of the reasons why we have many oil and gas companies, for instance, moving into their names into energy companies, etc., not only because they see that they have a social and environmental responsibility, but because they need to do this to maintain their access to finance. And I think for me, these are blind spots that are interesting to enlighten to some extent so that they can become more actionable for players who are non-finance experts?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And along the lines of seeing the coal barges while you're sitting at a meeting in Bonn is crazy, right? I heard a podcast, excuse me, last week about the fact that many coal plants in the United States are operated for hundreds, if not thousands of hours a year unprofitably because they can make a return on investment according to the utility rules. And that cost has been quantified at least $2 billion, which is just insane. Anyway, great points, Rana. I'd like to hand it back to my colleague, Christiane Rosbach, to just provide some closing remarks. And maybe, I think it is unique. I guess I've been talking too long. The CASE program is unique in that they've stood up an entire communication support team, which is a fraction of the overall budget of the project, but the support team, which includes Edelman and ACE Partners, is working on doing some of these landscape assessments and working with people like Red and Fabi and Ganda and others. Why are they doing that? Why aren't other programs doing this? That's sort of an interesting question, but just to wrap up and talk about how CASE intends to engage, and not through a CASE branding, but really through a more serving the energy transition community. So over to you, Christiana, for some closing remarks.
Thank you very much. And I would first of all like to say how much I agree really with Rana, because coming into this space more from a communications perspective, the walls can be quite high in terms of really understanding what it means, what we're talking about, where we want to head with this. So really taking that perspective and what would be really relevant and what would be really the kind of narratives that we need to drive that are resonating with the people that we really need to reach. So that is something that we touched upon in this session today. Who are really these audiences? We do not have a massive amount of time. Who do we really need to prioritize? Who has the influence to seek that kind of change that we want to make? That does not necessarily mean, as we discussed, to only focus on one stakeholder, but maybe on different stakeholder groups, and to really understand their concerns and their interests as well, and how they would see opportunities. From there, in a way, looking into some of the messages and how they would have to relate, or that narrative and storytelling, and how that would need to relate to areas that are close to people's hearts, and that are ensuring that it's really something that is an inclusive growth, that is an inclusive movement. That is something quite important. And when we're talking about that story, something that came out also out from Red's remarks and also from some other speakers, is really also about putting it as a story of opportunities, but also of pitfalls from an investment perspective, so an investment story. Something that I would like to add here is there were some comments about how do you communicate some research and it's very long documents. That's something where probably we need to have some more conversations in terms of what would be the platforms, what would be the channels, what would be the type of content, because it might not be about communicating the entirety of a report, but one key finding and making that key finding relevant. And that could also overcome some of that wall of jargon that might keep some of the non-energy platform or non-energy stakeholders out of the conversation at the moment. And finally, I would just like to touch upon one area that was also mentioned in some of the comments, that is that we're now living in this kind of post-truth world, and we need to operate within that system, and we need to understand that we're living in this kind of environment. So where we have these echo chambers where people who are of a different opinion might not move, where we have an infodemic of so much information going out, and a recent trust barometer just showing that only about a quarter of people have a good information hygiene, so really knowing in a way what sources they are consuming before they're spreading. Maybe it's also some misinformation. So these are things that we need to consider. But what we could maybe take into account is like, who do we really want to reach? And where on the spectrum are they? Can we influence? Can we have that dialogue? There might be some that are too far out on the spectrum, but there might be some others that we can take along and take into this exciting world that you've been painting now during this conversation. So as CASE and as part of CASE, really excited to have this conversation. And I just saw in the comments as well that there was a request to have more of these kind of conversations with energy stakeholders and energy communication professionals around the region. And I can only echo that. And I hope that this is not a one-off event, but that we can really make that into a dialogue on how can we find this kind of evidence? How can we find that kind of messaging? How do we really identify what evidence we use towards which stakeholder? So really, really interesting conversation, and I immensely enjoyed listening to all of the speakers. And I would like to thank you very much for your time, and also from the audience. It's quite late here in this region already, so thank you very much for making the time.
Thank you.
And with that, I'm heading back to Peter.
Well, and I don't know if you want to come back in, Mark, our MC, and so
Yeah, thank you everyone for joining us in this event. As we mentioned earlier, this is the only communications focused session at ASF. We are hoping that this won't be the last communications focused discussion in the energy sector. Thank you again for joining, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.